Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to the Auckland Unitarian Church. Whether you are regular worshippers here or visitors or somewhere in between, we hope you will feel at home with us. For today's service, I prepared two stories about people who feel they don't belong, but they were both lucky and found other people who welcomed them. I hope you will agree that New Zealand is mostly a welcoming country, and this is mostly a welcoming congregation. That's not always true, so we always need to work on it. So I invite you all to share this task with me of creating a supportive community here in this church and in the wider world. And we invite you to join with us in a cup of tea or coffee afterwards. Welcome. In the Bible, the book of the prophet Isaiah has got an amazing chapter about transgender people. They were eunuchs, slaves who had been forcibly operated on to change their sexual orientation. Not a very well-known passage from the Bible. It was a shocking treatment, and to make it worse, these slaves were often shut out of other activities, including being accepted as worshippers. Some people regarded them as defective. But the prophet Isaiah looked forward to a day when they and foreigners would be welcomed in the Jewish temple at Jerusalem. He wrote these words, "Do not let the foreigner who is joined to the Lord say, 'The Lord will surely separate me from his people.' And do not let the eunuch say, 'I am just a dry tree.' For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name, better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." I like this chalice as a symbol of our shared hopes and our shared commitment to one another. In the Christian Bible, the book of Acts has a whole lot of over-the-top stories about the Christian gospel spreading out to other nations. For instance, there's one about Peter dreaming about a Roman centurion called Cornelius, and at the same time, Cornelius just happens to be dreaming about a man called Peter, and the two of them meet, and Cornelius joins the church. In another story, there's an earthquake that breaks open the prisoner that two apostles had been locked into, but instead of escaping from prison, they just stay in the jail singing, and they convert the jailkeeper to being a Christian. What a far-out story. About a dozen of these altogether. But I think the most unusual of them all is the story of the Transgender Bookworm in Acts chapter 8. This transgender person, a eunuch, was riding a chariot across the desert, reading to himself from the book of Isaiah, which just happens to be the very book in the Bible that welcomes eunuchs. Now, how did all these pieces come together in this story? For starters, the evangelist Philip was walking along a desert road. He saw a chariot coming along, but how did he know the man in the chariot was a eunuch? And the answer is that eunuchs had a distinctive high-pitched voice, like a woman's voice, but more resonant. The second question is, how did Philip hear this loud-pitched voice? And the answer is that this eunuch, sitting in his chariot, was reading aloud all by himself. And that solves the third mystery of how did Philip know the eunuch was reading from the prophet Isaiah. The answer was that the early Christians knew and loved the prophet Isaiah. So Philip recognized the words that this man was reading out. And he couldn't resist running up to the chariot to discuss it with another fan of the prophet Isaiah. There were a lot of fans of the prophet Isaiah in the first century. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are more more copies of the prophet Isaiah than all the other readings put together. What was so special about being a eunuch in those times? A eunuch was a man who had been castrated, and most eunuchs were slaves, and their owners cut off their sexual organs when they were about 9 years old, so they would grow up with no sex drive, so they could be trusted to guard a harem or to guard a queen, which is what this eunuch did. He was the finance minister for the Queen of Ethiopia. Being a eunuch meant they could also be trusted not to have children of their own. So if they rose to high office, as this man had, they would not be able to start a royal family of their own. Castration was a gruesome fate for a young boy. More than half of them died through loss of blood. But those who survived could rise to higher jobs, requiring high trust, high strength, and high intelligence. In some Jewish circles, eunuchs were regarded as defective and shameful, and so they were not allowed to become converted to Judaism. Yet this particular eunuch was attracted to the Jewish faith. And that is the big drama of this story. He liked Judaism, but he would never have been allowed to become a Jew. People who were on the fringe of Judaism are referred to in the New Testament as God-fearers. They respected the Jewish faith, but they were never fully accepted into it. And many of the first Christians were God-fearers. In Judaism, they were on the fringe. However, in the Christian churches, they were welcomed as full members. And that's part of what this story is about. This God-fearer was, in fact, coming back home from a visit to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. So it's ironic that he was reading this scripture aloud like the leaders used to do in the temple, but as a eunuch, he would never have been allowed to read it in a temple. But he was a specially favoured eunuch. He was wealthy. He had his own copy of the Isaiah scroll, and he must have really enjoyed reading it aloud to himself from his chariot. The New Revised Version of the Bible has a commentary in it, and the commentary on this passage says that Luke, who wrote this story, probably knew the Isaiah book well himself, and he would know those words I quoted earlier about eunuchs being welcomed into the temple. So Luke has written this story, weaving in the story of the welcome of eunuchs into the church, and it's probably fiction, but it's based on fact that eunuchs were in fact welcomed into the early church. This is not the only mention of eunuchs in the New Testament. St. Paul sarcastically says to Christians who wanted to be circumcised, "Why don't you go all the way and make eunuchs of yourselves?" So Paul reflects the view that eunuchs were defective and something to be ashamed of. But Jesus reflects the view that eunuchs were dedicated, trustworthy people. And he said in the Sermon on the Mount, there were some people who have been made eunuchs by other people, but there were some who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. This is a mystery verse. Scholars have still not agreed on what it was all about. Was Jesus really saying that people should become eunuchs to join the kingdom of heaven? Some scholars say he did not mean it literally. He meant somebody who had turned down family life so he could serve the church. Jesus may have included himself in this way as someone who turned down family life for the sake of the kingdom of God. But whatever interpretation you take, it suggests that Jesus did not regard being a eunuch as a sign of disgrace, but as a sign of dedication. And this story of Philip talking to the eunuch in his chariot ends with the eunuch politely asking Philip, "Is there any reason why I could not be baptized?" And Philip doesn't answer it, but his answer is a yes, no. They saw a pool of water in the desert, and Philip baptized him, and he became a Christian. And part of the magic of the story, Philip gets magically whisked away by God to do another mission somewhere else. And it says the eunuch went on his way praising and rejoicing God. He was rejoicing that he'd been accepted as a full member of the church, along with Jesus, who also was seen as a person of disgrace. And Isaiah said that eunuchs were now welcome as full members of the Jewish community. Looking to the future, the Christian church did not regard celibacy as a sign of disgrace, almost the opposite. And in 18th century Italy, eunuchs were prized by the church for their voices. The Vatican had a choir of eunuchs, and some poor families had the young boys castrated so they could look for a career as opera singers or professional choir members. When I read this, I was rather puzzled. Why didn't the Vatican just have women to sing these high notes? Would have been a bit simpler, wouldn't it? But the reason is that while eunuchs had the vocal cords of a woman, they had the resonance and lung capacity of a man, and this was prized, a bit like a countertenor, singing a powerful, a high-pitched voice. This was an awful thing to impose on a young boy, but it clearly had a positive value for some people in those days. So I would say that eunuchs throughout the history of the church were a group of transgender people who were made for the service of slave owners, and they were regarded as second-class citizens in some circles, but they're honoured and welcomed in others. And today, where does that put us? Today, I think we rightly welcome people of all sexual lifestyles, including transgender people, some of whom who do get hormone treatment and gender change surgery. So gender change is not a new thing at all, but it has a new relevance today. This story is almost too good to be true, but I think it is fiction, but I think it is based on fact that Luke wanted to say people of these kinds would be welcome. But there's a second mystery in this story. Did people in the first century really read the Bible out loud to themselves while they were travelling in their chariots? It doesn't seem to make sense. But if they didn't read out loud, this story could not have happened. And this problem is still being debated by historians. I support the historians who say this was a transition period from when reading was something that only happened in public, like in churches and other meetings, because most people couldn't read, and it's gradually changed to now where it's the exact opposite. We mostly read in private, and so we don't read aloud. In between, there were a few rich individuals who had their own copies of the books of the time, and they would read these out loud to themselves because that was the way you read in those days. Supporting this theory is another unusual Christian leader in the 4th century, Bishop Ambrose of Milan. He was famous for reading the Bible to himself silently, and visitors to his home were surprised by this, as if he was the first person to read the Bible in silence. This story is reported by St. Augustine. He wrote in his diary that when Ambrose used to read, his eyes followed the pages while his heart searched for its meaning. However, his voice and tongue were silent. Often when we were present, we saw him reading in this fashion silently and never otherwise. That seems to be clear evidence this was a relatively new thing, and that Ambrose was one of the trendsetters in reading the Bible and other books silently. This was only one of the series of changes in the technology of reading. There was another big change in the 9th century in China, when woodblock printing meant you could print a whole page at a time. You could theoretically have printed a whole book that way, but it was very slow work making the woodblock, so it was not that practical. It would have cost you a fortune to make and print a book that way. And of course, as you know, these problems were finally solved in Europe in the 15th century when Gutenberg made movable type so you could set up a whole page in minutes rather than days. And like all Europeans, he used the Latin alphabet, which had only 26 characters, give or take. The Chinese also invented movable type, but they had thousands of characters, and so it just would not be practical to rearrange a book page by page that way. But with Gutenberg, suddenly there was a change in the way people read. Lay people could afford their own copies of the Bible and others' books. And of course, this meant the lay people could challenge their preachers on the interpretation of the Bible. They would say, hang on, you've left out that bit. I remember that part, and doesn't mean what you said. It also meant that lay people could read the prayers in a church service, because everybody could buy a copy of the prayer book. So those things, Christians tend to regard those as good news. But the bad news was that heretical books became cheaper as well. Such heretical books, of course, you would be crazy to read out loud, dangerous even. People, in fact, did get executed for reading the wrong books and for writing the wrong books. And so it was perhaps the invention of censorship and criticism of the Bible. And it took different forms in different countries. And there were wars of religion between them. All of these things happened because it became cheaper to read and write. It democratized reading. The same kind of explosion has happened in our own time and since the 19th century. Telephones brought us in touch at a distance, and even illiterate people could use them. Then radio brought us in touch without needing wires between you and the sender and the receiver. But this had its dangerous side as well. If you had a radio in an enemy country, spies could pass their information instantaneously. And so people who had radios with them could be arrested and were arrested and killed for having an international radio and speaking to the enemy. Radio also meant you could speak to millions of people at the same time. Someone pointed out that Hitler could not have achieved control over Germany as he did without being an expert in the use of radio. And the internet suddenly had a further democratizing of information. It suddenly meant that ordinary people could speak to the whole nation. You didn't need to own a radio station. And in China, when my wife Marion and I visited a few years ago, we found that our cell phones were being jammed by the government. We could still send emails, but we couldn't send Facebook messages. So technology has constantly been changing the way we communicate. I remember another one, not that people might forget now, but in the 1960s, I was a minister, and somebody discovered the Gestetner, which is a way of printing out a service sheet in a hurry by a stencil put over an inky roller, and you could roll these things off. But this changed the way ministers worked. No longer did you need to use the prayer book. Every minister could write their own prayers. And equally, it was quite cheap to do. And equally, the members of the congregation who didn't like the prayers would throw them all in the rubbish when they got back home. So it's a dramatic change in the politics of worship. All these changed the balance of powers. Cell phones have been an even bigger change only in the last decade or two. When they first came in, I thought this is only a small change. What difference does it make? You can ring people up. You could always ring people up at home, but in a cell phone, it meant you didn't have to wait till they got home. You could ring them at work. And this looked like a great advantage, but actually was an even bigger nuisance because you're constantly getting calls from people when you're in the middle of something else. And so we started switching to another new technology of texting. And texting, of course, is much more courteous. You can send a message to somebody when they're in the middle of church, in the middle of a meeting, and they can reply without ever annoying those around them. Many people criticise cell phones, and still do, saying it's unsociable to have a conversation with somebody who is absent, ignoring the people who are in the same room. But that ignores the needs of the isolated person, like the eunuch, who were estranged from people around them and would not be able to so readily converse with them, but had friends from different times and different places that they could read. And so to read opened a door to some people while it closed the door to others. And if we are in a room taking a cell phone message, rather than being a break in our communication, It could be an increase if you ask the person, how is so-and-so today? Why not bring the remote message into your present conversation? And that is what this eunuch in the first century did. He brought the book of Isaiah into his own century, and by doing so, he met another man who shared that knowledge with him. Ironically, people regard cell phones as incredibly dangerous because how can you drive a car and read at the same time? Well, that problem also is in this story. How do you hold the reins of a chariot and unroll a scroll and have a conversation with somebody alongside you at the same time? And I checked that also. Weren't these chariots absolutely a menace? And the answer is they were. And in the time of the first century, people no longer used chariots in war. For that very reason, they were unstable. It was impossible to fight with a sword and steer a team of horses at the same time. And so they stopped using them for war, but the Romans kept using them in the arenas for chariot races because they didn't care about them being dangerous. That was half the fun of them, watching these slaves killing themselves as their chariots overturned on the corners. So it was a bit of history of that time. But I hope you will share with me this feeling that the ancient technology of communication has been controversial every step of the way. There have been people who welcomed the new technology. There have been people who opposed it. There have been people who used it for good purposes and people who used it for bad. But still, this wealth of technology is of great use to us. Even the books are coming back into their own. I myself, for instance, discovered this book when somebody read a story from it, and I thought, that's a great story. I'd like to read that. So I looked up on the internet in the Auckland Public Library, and they've got copies there. And so the technology of reading still opens new ways of sharing, and I believe this is the point I'd like to end on, that books and all forms of communication are a tremendous resource for good, and rather than opposing them, we should be finding out the creative uses that can also be made from the same technology. For our meditation, I suggest we spend a period thinking ourselves through some of the people that we find it hard to communicate with, people who in some cases may be different from us, they're different sexual orientation, different religious beliefs, and thinking of how perhaps we can overcome these communication breakdowns. Let's pause and think. And now for our closing words, I'd like to read this benediction. May love inspire you, wisdom guide you, and peace surround you until we meet again. And now let's listen to our first reading.